species of warblers that occur in Scotland. And then we're going to talk a bit about what we found out about them at Hadfast. And from that, we're going to move into the wider countryside and what lessons there are about how best to preserve habitat for these small creatures and other creatures. And then we're going to have a look at migration for all sorts of other things, birds and other animals. So to begin with, we're not going to look at warbler, we're going to look at the swallow, because that's what everybody thinks of when they think about a migrant. They are not entirely typical. They are, however, very, very familiar, and we've got all sorts of sayings and things about them. There used to be some very strange ideas about swallows, which we shouldn't be too critical of. And one of them was that they spent the winter in the bottom of ponds. Now, that isn't quite as daft as it seems, because people in the olden days were living closer to nature. They were fairly acute observers, and they did notice that when swallows were on the wing and had stopped breeding, they often would go to feed over water bodies, and they would often roost in the reeds. And so when suddenly one morning there were no swallows there, you can see why this idea that they went to the bottom of ponds came. Obviously they don't, so we'll have a look at what they do. And swallows are unusual in small birds in that we actually know quite a lot about them. They go right down to South Africa. And when we look at the warblers, we'll see that that is not terribly typical. And because there are a lot of people in South Africa bird studying and able to do things like bird ringing, you've got, if you look at the left-hand map, you've got lots and lots of recoveries of British swallows. So we know where they go in the winter. The top right picture is not mine. Most of the pictures tonight are not mine. I had all sorts of pictures from Hadfast, which ended up getting dumped because they got mouldy and I never got around to scanning them in. The interesting there is that this was taken in the Kruger Park in South Africa. And so they were obviously photographing elephants, and this young elephant came out of the bush, and I don't know if they even realised it at the time. They photographed a swallow and have helpfully put a ring around it. So that's where our swallows get to, in big, big numbers. The other little graphic there gives you some idea of the numbers. Big, big numbers. Now, why is it? It sounds, this huge effort of crossing the Sahara twice a year. Well, the answer is basically to get away from competition, because if you can cross the Sahara, you come up to Northern Europe, Russia, and in the case of this species, and there's a very similar one in North America. So this is a couple of pages from the South African Field Guide. There are yet more swallows in other parts of Africa, and these things are staying around in Africa. So there's quite a lot of competition for insect food and things. So our ones simply avoid this by making this perilous journey. And that means that our swallow is more numerous probably than all the African species combined, because it's the only swallow in our area. And it, as I say, it occurs over a big, big area in the Northern Hemisphere in the summer, because in the Northern Hemisphere, temporarily, you've got this tremendous food resource. Another area where there was a rather strange belief with some of the birds that come to us in the winter, barnacle geese were thought to turn into goose barnacles. You can see a goose barnacle there and some on the rocks. Now, again, it's maybe not quite as daft as it sounds, because you would see them heading off in the spring, disappearing below the horizon. And before you had binoculars and all this sort of things, it really probably did look as though they went into the sea. But we now know they go off to places like Svalbard and Greenland. Anyway, a little summary, because we are all interested in whether it's birds, moths, whatever. It's a hobby, I suppose, a passion with some of us. And it's certainly been very obvious in the last 12 months that if you've got some interest in nature, whatever it is, you've been able to cope with the whole COVID-19 lockdown, etc., much, much better than most. But what we've got to understand is that we are in this remarkable position where one of the biggest problems we've got in this country is actually too many people, including myself, eat too much. If you're trying to get some handle on what it is to be like a wild creature, right at the top is whether they can get enough to eat. Probably the thing that controls the numbers of most wild things most of the time is food availability. If they've got enough food, then they will try and breed. Sometimes they don't live very long. Certainly a lot of these little birds don't. In the case of birds, then we've got this whole business of molting. They've got to renew their feathers, and that's very, very important. And in the case of the birds we're talking about tonight, for most of the talk, they've got this long migration, and then they will die. And although everyone who's listening into this will be an acute and interested observer of nature, mostly you're not conscious when you go around in the countryside of seeing dead bodies all the time. But if you think of something like a blue tit that maybe has got 8 young, by the next breeding season, you're back to 2 blue tits. So clearly there's an awful lot of death going on. And although the wildlife films tend to show you predation, which can be very spectacular, most of the time it's either disease or starvation. So that's a summary of the kind of pressure that the wild things are under. That I'm not saying we aren't under pressure. There's a food bank about a mile from where I'm sitting just now, but that's a different type of pressure. So let's not just look at some warblers, but listen to them. Willow Warbler we're starting with because it's by far the commonest. There's 4 or 5 times the number of Willow Warblers in Scotland in the summer than there are swallows. With birds, we have standardized English names, but I've put up the Latin names as well, just to show within this group of 10 the relationships, because one of the things, the concept of biodiversity is not actually one where we come out terribly well. Basically, the nearer you are to the equator, the more biodiverse you are. If you're on an island, you tend to be less biodiverse. Well, we're on an island, we're nearer the North Pole than the equator, so we don't have the kind of biodiversity with birds and all sorts of other things. If you'd go to Central Europe, you'd get a lot more different warblers. But anyway, we've got 3 molluscs. They're all called leaf warblers because they do tend to spend a bit of time up in the trees, and you can see the adult willow warbler there doing that. Explanation about the figures. The South East Scotland Bird Atlas estimates that there are 85,000 breeding pairs of willow warblers in our area in the summer. The -66 is the British Trust for Ornithology bird track. Now that shows they're declining, and yet the +18 is what's happening in Scotland. And what's happening with willow warblers, this may be true of a number of other things, the declines are mostly in southern, particularly southeast England, may well be related to the habitat down there. Also, in the case of willow warbler, climate, because they're also doing a little bit better in Scotland. And this is a very good time to look for them. The bottom right picture shows you a young one. When they're recently fledged, they look a lot yellower. And although they spend a lot of time hopping about in trees and things, the picture there shows you that they actually nest in the ground. Anyway, I stopped for a minute and we just enjoyed the song. Can you give me another heads up, Nick? Are you hearing that okay?
I can hear you.
Yeah, coming through loud and clear.
Good, good. We have enabled the computer. So we'll just enjoy the willow warbler for a little time. It's a descending sort of a song, a little bit like chaffinch, but drops off more at the end. Anyway, if you go to Hadfast and all sorts of other places just now, you'll certainly see, because they're coming in at this moment. Now, 1 or 2 things that you may be less familiar with unless you actually handle birds. The top picture isn't a warbler, but with birds where you can't easily tell the difference by the feathers, male and female, if you very gently blow on them, at this time of year, basically the females drop quite a lot of their feathers, and the under parts become, you almost think they've got an infection. They haven't. It's just the blood vessels are pushing forward so that they can transfer warmth from the female's body to the eggs, and the males never quite develop a patch to this thing. So that's a useful technique. And the other thing in this business about molt, feathers are very, very useful things. They're light, they're important when a bird has to fly. The longer feathers, we're looking at the wings just now, allow them to fly. The tail feathers help them to steer, and the smaller feathers keep them insulated, which is quite important if you think of how cold it's been the recent mornings. Now, they've got to renew their feathers at least once a year. One of the really odd things about willow warblers is they actually do it twice, which puzzles me, but nobody's quite explained why. They do it in Scotland around about July, and they do it in Africa again when they're down there in the winter. And they've got to fit this molting between their breeding and going off in migration. Now, there's a couple of pictures there of the same bird, not my pictures, I'm afraid. And if you follow my little mouse, we're looking here at what we'll call the 10 primaries, and they start there. The other ones to the left we'll not bother about just now. And this bird has already, when it was caught on the 5th of July, it's already grown these feathers, it's growing these ones, it's still to drop these ones. Then by 18th of July, you can see that there are a lot of fresh feathers here, and it's almost finished. Now, even if you don't get the same bird 2 or 3 times, you can draw little graphs, and from that we know that a willow warbler takes something like 36, 38 days to renew its feathers before it can fly off. So that's all got to be factored in. This is a BTO graph. It's what they call their historical recording, because when we were studying these things in detail, we were doing them in the 70s and 80s, and basically we'll follow this thing, and you can see this is for the whole of Britain. So we're coming in southern England in April. The peak numbers being recorded were late April. Now, to put this in the Scottish context, in some years, we never had any warblers at Hadfast other than some male willow warblers in some years. That has changed quite a bit. Now, the line drops off a bit. This doesn't mean there are fewer birds. It just means they're busy away, first breeding and then molting and things. This is them molting. You see they become a lot less obvious because they're hiding away a bit as they're not able to fly quite so well. So within there, they've got to have paired up, built a nest, lay maybe 6 eggs, that's 6 days, a couple of weeks sitting on them, a couple of weeks with the young in the nest, and then flying about. So they're starting to fly about round about late into June here. July is probably the molt time, and people started seeing them again. And you'll notice by August, this is because they're starting to move in Britain, and they're starting to disappear. And what is striking about this is that they're not actually here all that long. They're moving back southwards, and when you sometimes see birds at coastal sites like Barnes Ness or the Isle of May, they're not necessarily our ones. One of the things that happens, we've said what happens with the older ones, they have to renew their feathers and things. These are a couple of graphs. Not going to have too many graphs, I promise you. And these are the young ones, and these are the records back in some years ago now, records of up to 60, 75 young birds. And these are the ones, not just the ones that were bred at Hadfast, but the ones that were wandering through the area. Because what happens with young birds, whether it's blue tits or willow warblers, they wander around because they're trying to get a fix on the area when they come back next year, if they survive the migration, because they'll be looking for somewhere to breed, and they may not be able to breed where they were reared because maybe their father's still got that territory. So you can see this great wandering. And yet you can see when we come into August, it's dropping off. So this is just reinforcing this idea that they aren't with us all that terribly long. Now, what then happens to them? Well, there are very few dots on the map, especially down in Africa, but there are enough dots from these ringing recoveries to say they're heading to spend the winter somewhere in West Africa, well south of the Sahara. They're into some of the moist forests. And that's true of an awful lot of these things. Now, this is quite a recent thing from BTO, and really what this is showing you is a more up-to-date. So going to Willow Warbler here, this is the mean or the average, and you can see we're much earlier in April. Some of them are now coming in, maybe it's more so down south, in late March. They're mostly in by well before the end of April. So all these migrants are turning up an awful lot earlier than they used to. So there's a bit less time pressure. And the one we're going to look at in a minute, which is chiffchaff, and you can see that most of them are in before the end of March. Now, the problem with saying too much about chiffchaff at Hadfast is we didn't used to have very many. And that situation has changed very dramatically. So let's look at some numbers. Plus 110 for Britain, plus 780 for Scotland. Now, this is not, I don't mean 780 individual chiffchaffs. This is a kind of scale. So they really got a much, much commoner. Still not as common as willow warblers. This was the 17,000 estimate for southeast Scotland. Well, that was done a few years ago. The 5 was the estimate for how many are wintering here, and there's probably a bit more than that now. The nest on the ground, a bit like willow warblers. The pictures. The one on the left is a chiffchaff. They look very similar. They used to all be called willow wrens till Gilbert White realised they were different species. This one here is a hybrid. This is quite unusual with birds, but we had one good record at Hadfast where when a bird got killed, its partner paired up with another species. When we come to the song, then you probably know this, they sing their name. Chiff-chaffing away, and in Germany, Zilpsalp and various European countries we get this. One of the interesting things, because they're around a lot longer, is do they produce 2 broods of young? Because most warblers in Scotland only have time for 1, but that may be something that is now changing. So we've heard the chiff-chaff. We're going to move on, And we're going to, this is just a bit more evidence. This is the South East Scotland Bird Atlas, and you can see the upright arrows. Basically, it's showing you, and they've got a gain, is it 624 on my screen anyway. So they've got a whole lot commoner in the breeding season. This map from the BTO Migration Atlas shows you basically where some of the ones that are coming into us and from wintering, they tended to be commoner down south in the winter, but there was several round about Leith this winter, and we're not quite clear yet whether the ones that come for the winter are the ones that are also here in the summer or not. We'll see why that matters in a moment. Another thing about chiffchaff, if you look at the world distribution and look at the red, they cover a vast area, and if you start getting late chiffchaffs, they're probably some of these Russian ones that are a bit off course. They tend to winter round about here. Mostly ours don't seem to cross the Sahara. Now, one of the reasons why they seem to be becoming more numerous is that with milder winters and things, they are wintering around the Mediterranean. They have a shorter journey back, and that's probably a main factor why they're now probably at least as common as willow warblers. The third philosque is wood warbler, and it's anything but common. The only numbers I can give you there is -63 for the UK. They're having a catastrophic decline. Now, wood warbler is not one you'll get. I've once heard a wood warbler at Hadfast, and it was one off course. There is nowhere in the Lothians where they now regularly breed. They did occasionally turn up at places like Woodhall or Roslin. There's one or two woods in the borders, but if you want to see and hear them, you're probably better going further west. Nobody's quite sure. Some people thought the decline was linked to deteriorating habitat, too much deer pressure, but more and more the thinking is that it's something that's happening to non-migration, or possibly something that's happening in Africa. Now, there's some very interesting stuff going on with wood warbler just now. Basically, they're able to put tiny little geolocators on them, and we'll show you one of those with another warbler in a few minutes. And we're now getting some information. And one of the things that's coming out is they don't just go down to West Africa into these wet forests, they move around. So that may give some indication, because a lot of these trans-Saharan migrants are not doing so well just now. So again, let's hear a very distinctive song. If you do get a good view of one, there's quite a contrast between the yellow and the white. But that's one that you're not going to get very easily in our area. Okay, let's move into the wetter places, except sedge warbler is something that doesn't just occur in very wet places, and they're both in the same genus. So there was terrific interest in these birds in southern England, and this transferred up to us as to how these closely related little creatures operated. Well, partly it's habitat. Sedge warblers are often in areas, it's not just sedges, they're not necessarily in straight reed beds, and the numbers of them are quite reasonable. There's the Lothian figure. Plus 99 is the figure for reed warbler in Britain. They are colonising Scotland, and somebody was mentioning Dunningston. That would certainly be the sort of place to go for them. You won't get reed warbler at Hadfast. And let's have a listen to the songs. They're very scratchly, jangly sort of songs. That's the sedge. Now reed. There's frogs in the background, wherever that was recorded. They're not my recordings. Okay. Reed warbler, as the name implies, there's a reed warbler nest, actually in the reeds. Sedge warbler, very often in scrubby, slightly damp vegetation, away from the reeds. The molt thing with things like willow warbler, we've said they molt in Britain and again in Africa, which is unusual. With sedge warbler, if you look at the right-hand picture, they go off and molt in Africa, and that's They go off in very worn wings. This shows you just how much wear there is in these little birds' wings. And the different warblers have different strategies, but it has to go to Africa on those wings and tail and then change its feathers. Now, a little bit more on why closely related little birds can coexist. The very good picture, chap in north of England did that, it's not mine. There's a reed warbler fly catching. Reed warblers are much more active, although in the breeding season they're in the reed beds, they're quite acrobatic. By contrast, sedge warblers, although they don't breed in such damp places, they then move off and they move into reed beds, particularly on the south coast of England. And on the left there's a thing called the plum reed aphid, and that's what they basically feed on in big numbers before they go off in migration. So they actually almost switch their habitats. And another thing, this is just to show how complicated all this is that somebody was studying these things in West France. There's a reed warbler, there's a sedge warbler, and they were just getting an idea where they fed, and they're feeding roughly the same places in the reeds. So if you're trying to build up a picture of how these little birds coexist, it's quite complicated. Something as simple as saying some feed higher up than the others doesn't quite explain it. There's Willow Warbler, they're in the reeds, not in the trees, and we'll say a little bit about why that is in a minute, but they were obviously feeding a bit higher up. So we're building up a picture of these little birds kind of coexist. They don't all do quite the same things, but it's quite a complicated pattern. The migration of sedge warbler is a little bit different. Pretty much all, with one exception of these little birds, head down to West Africa. Now, with sedge warbler, which is this one on the left, you will see that there's lots of blobs round about here. They seem to move down to the south of England, and then quite a lot of them don't. They go all the way. Some of them go into France. There's very few turning up here. A lot of them are putting on enough weight, and these things are maybe going from 10 grams up to 15 grams, and off they go. And they're really on a, hiding for nothing. They've got to get away down here because there's not much food for them in and around this. Now, that's a little bit unusual. The reed warbler, if you notice what is happening, there's a lot more of them here and all the way down into Spain and Portugal, and they seem to be moving down, and then they're going for it. And even then, some of them are turning up in Morocco. So we've got a somewhat different migration pattern. Grasshopper warbler, we can't tell you a lot about, but they're intriguing things. The numbers don't 200. That's the number in Lothian and southeast Scotland. It's a bit of a guess, to be honest. They have the most intriguing song. Hadfast getting a bit overgrown for them. But there's another area I'll show you in a few minutes if you want to get grasshopper warbler, and you can combine this with Hadfast, and you could certainly end up with 8 species of warbler. And as far as we know, they are also heading down to West Africa, but we don't know an awful lot about these little birds. We know a bit more about these, the whitethroat and the lesser whitethroat. And whitethroats, they are mostly not in yet. They're a bit later than willow warblers. They fly, often have a little song flight, and they have a jangly sort of song, so we're going to hear it in a moment. Numbers, they were going down quite spectacular in Britain, but they're picking up in Scotland, and that's the 15,000 estimate for southeast. Now, lesser whitethroat, this was the bird that Hadfast became known as the best place in Scotland for lesser whitethroat. They're now somewhere else, but what seems to have happened, in the 1970s, we found them breeding there, and there was nowhere else in Scotland had been recorded, and all the books said that they didn't breed in Scotland. Well, they do breed in Scotland, but what seems to have happened is they push north, and they're now probably dropping back a bit. So we've not got many numbers other than a rough estimate of maybe 100 pairs in the Lothians. The song, they don't sing very, because they're at low density, you don't often hear this. It's a rattle, a bit like the start of a yellowhammer. Listen out for it, because once they're paired up, they seem to stop singing. Okay, now migration of whitethroat, fairly typical. A lot of these little birds, they work their way down, eventually get into places like Portugal, and then they go for it. And there aren't many dots down here, but we know that they are in Africa, but they're not quite as far south as willow warblers. And we'll see what effects that's had on them. Lesser whitethroat is quite different. And you see that, again, mostly from ringing in England, they're heading away towards the other end of the Mediterranean. They winter in places like Ethiopia. There's the two nests. They're not terribly different. These are all Sylvia warblers, and they all have these fairly similar nests, and often in bramble or thorn. Now, this is the thing that happened to the whitethroats. Round about the end of the 6th and early 70s, you may remember there was this catastrophic droughts in the Sahel. Now, the whitethroats winter in this sort of habitat along the southern edge of the desert, and the southern edge of the desert moved from the top one to the bottom one, and the whitethroats didn't have Bob Geldof and all these looking out for them. So the numbers, as you can see at the bottom right, absolutely crashed, although they've picked up a little bit since. I think there's more and more evidence that sometimes the numbers of these birds are affected not by what's happening in our area, but what's happening where they're going for the winter. And this is just a couple of graphics to show you what's been happening with Lake Chad, which is this huge, or used to be a great big blob on the map of Africa, and it's a whole lot smaller now. And that means that there's much less in the way of reed beds. There's a lot less insects and things coming off the reed beds, so there's less chance for a lot of these birds to get the food they need before they come back across the desert in spring. The two more, the garden warbler, which is a really silly name. The only gardens I've ever seen these in have been the abandoned lighthouse gardens in places like St Abbs or the Isle of May. This is a long distance migrant, -29 for Britain, 2,000 for southeast Scotland. I think that's optimistic. The problem we've got with these birds is that the songs of these two, the blackcap, they're more similar than any other two songs of any British birds. The whitethroat is a little bit throatier. So, sorry, the garden warbler. So we'll start with him. Blackbird there as well. We'll stop him and we'll compare it with blackcap. There's the male blackcap because the females have a brown cap. It's not quite so strident, it's not quite so throaty, perhaps a little bit more musical. Both these birds tend to sing from bushes under cover, and you can spend ages trying to get a view of them. So every year I have to listen and get my ear in. But if you're in a tall doubt, it's almost certainly a blackcap, because we'll just try and stop that one. If you look at the numbers, 297 plus for Britain, 451 for Scotland. The 16,000 is the estimate. They may be too low now for the southeast of Scotland. The 100 is the estimate for wintering, and that's almost certainly too low. When you go up to garden warbler, -29 for Britain, and 2,000, which I think I said already is probably too high now. And this is the difference between the long distance migrant, because blackcaps, our ones mainly, and we'll explain a bit more about this, mainly seem to be wintering around the med. So like the chiffchaff, they don't have quite such a long or hazardous journey to get here. There's the nests, both in bramble. Bramble's a very useful thing for nests, not terribly different. There is a bit more in them. That's not my picture, that's far too good. You'll notice the young ones all have brown caps. This is probably because if they had black caps, they'd be attacked by their own father. Now, a lot of these Sylvia warblers, once they get down, whether it's Spain or West Africa in winter, they're in quite dry, bushy places, so they eat quite a lot of little berries. And this is why there's a lot of blackcaps turning up in gardens in winter. And one idea is that one of the reasons we've now got a wintering population is they're getting food from nice people who put feeders out. However, I'll show you somewhere where I think there's something more natural happening in our area. Now, the complicated thing about blackcaps, we've already said that our ones seem to go down to the Mediterranean. The ones we get in the winter time, as all the evidence is that they are not the ones that are here in the summertime, and we'll expand on that in a minute. The map here on the right, the bigger map, this is the wintering map, and you can see people are finding blackcaps really quite a lot, so there's probably a lot more than 100. And you'll notice they tend to be particularly along the coast, as well as being in town gardens in Edinburgh. There's quite a few here around about Gullin and Aberlady. By contrast, these are a few wintering recoveries of garden warbler, and you can see they're way down in the moist forests. Rare warblers I'm going to say very little about, but if you go more so in autumn than in spring to somewhere like St Abb's Head, then you will get things like a yellow-browed warbler, a Pallas's warbler. This is the Siberian chiffchaff, dusky warbler, Rad's warbler. These are all things that should be wintering in places like India, and they're young birds that have gone totally off course and ended up in Western Europe. Right, let's have a look at Hadfast. This is an old picture scanned in. It's not always as colourful as here, but what is interesting about this is that nobody planted anything. There are far too many people wanting to go and plant trees now, and in some cases it can actually be harmful. In Hadfast, purely by accident, all this scrub has developed. One of the things that has helped it is there is no big seed source of sycamore, which can be quite an invasive thing and crowd out other things. And although it may not show terribly well in this picture, the scrub is quite open, and so there were a lot of other things coming up. And when the broom and the thorn has finished, there are other things like nettle and willow herb, which surprises some people, and we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. The other thing about Hadfast, this is the bit that is now the reserve. This bit here, there's a little bit at the end with an old orchard you can't quite see, and there used to be a fence along the bottom here. And this is roughly the same area as the bit that's now the reserve. Now, there used to be quite a lot of scrub here, but it's always been grazed by animals. And eventually the farmer tried to destroy the scrub, although you can see it's bouncing back. So this whole area here was hawthorn, and there was more hawthorn here. And the interesting thing was that we had nothing like so many warblers and finches in this, even though there's what appeared to be good habitat. And the main reason was that the scrub didn't have the herb layer and the bramble layer in among it. It's now all become a field. I think there may be a possibility of becoming a community woodland, but I don't know. So if we can just inflict a couple of graphs on you, this is basically, this pattern is something that is being shown with, for example, in the stuff that Oxford University have done in Tits and Wytham. Basically, we're looking here at hawthorn. I know the graph's a little bit cut off. And you've got this huge peak. And what we're doing here, this isn't the numbers of little insects, caterpillars, etc., that the warblers can eat. Basically, we've got the weight of them, which is what the birds are interested in. So you've got this great big peak round about May and early June. So clearly that's a useful time if you're a breeding warbler. Now, what this graph doesn't show is that a lot of that peak was made up of caterpillars, moth caterpillars, and that's quite advantageous because they're very easy to catch and take away. So from the breeding bird's point of view, whether you're a willow warbler or a blue tit, this is quite useful. But notice the way it drops off. The reason this happens is that as leaves become mature, they become much less palatable to caterpillars and insects. In some cases, they actually become toxic. Now, if we look at we've got this rosebay, which people often regard as a very invasive plant. It can be, but it's actually quite a useful thing. It's a bit like reeds. You'll notice the peak is coming much later. So we've got this early peak for the breeding and the feeding the young, and then we've got this when they're molting and stuff. And this seems to be one of the strengths of Hadfast, the idea that we've got other things in among the trees. So one of the things we got interested in was looking at similar habitats round about, and this is obviously a winter picture, and this is the Pincateland Railway Walk. So having found out that this kind of open herb-rich scrub was very good for small birds, then we found that some of the best areas round about were things like old coal tips. This is an old railway, now turned into a walkway, which is quite a good idea. This is from a Google map. There's the reserve bit there. There's the bit that was the comparison thing, now partly destroyed. You can see it's kind of isolated, so that means it's quite a good study site. This is this railway walk, and you can see there's a lot of scrub along here. And this, unfortunately, I lost some of my old slides. I used to have a slide which showed you little coloured dots, and we'd have warblers all the way along here. We'd have warblers at Hadfast. Things like the hedges, not so many. And one of the things that struck me was that some of the things that conservationists talk about, oh, hedges are very, very wonderful. Well, maybe in southern England they are, but in our area, a lot of them don't really hold very much. And some of these former industrial type areas, gravel pits would be another one, are probably more valuable. Now, more generally, if we look at the modern countryside, this is the view from North Berwick Law, and you can see that it's very well managed. I'm not farmer bashing here. They've been asked to produce food and they do. There's an interesting debate, which we can't really take time to do just now. Do we try and make this kind of fairly intensive more wildlife friendly, more traditional farming, or do you have a situation where you basically say, right, we're going to produce the food in these sorts of areas, we're going to have big conservation areas elsewhere. But certainly in the Lothians, what we found is that along some of the side roads, bankings, along a little river, there are areas that are quite good for these little birds, but the countryside generally is not terribly good. So another option is to have a look at our own areas, because Lothians is got more and more built up, and certainly within some of them there are areas of parks and woodland and whatnot. This is North Berwick from the Law. You'll see the Bash Rock there, more housing spreading out. So I got interested in seeing just how many of these birds occurred both in the wider countryside and in and around some of the towns. So this is the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. This is Wester Hailes, or the edge of it, with an interesting little bit, multi-storey blocks. This is post-war council type housing in Trinent. This one I didn't survey because it's far too new. I'm just making the point that gardens are getting smaller. So the idea that gardens are a wonderful haven for wildlife, I think is maybe a bit optimistic. Now, let's take Hadfast, the reserve right at the bottom. 34 species of songbirds, not just warblers, density of 22.5 per hectare. The best garden was the Botanics, 25, and the Botanics is bigger. 9, not anything like as good as Hadfast. Basically, it's too neat. There's not enough nettles and brambles. Trinent, 11, 3.9, not nearly. Wester Hailes, 1 or 2 more because of that scrub bit on the edge, 0.25. Multi-storey type housing, not surprisingly, hasn't got a terrific amount of habitat for small birds. You need 4 hectares of that sort of to get 1 pair of songbirds. If we look at farmland, 51 species, well, that's pretty good, but this was a huge area of farmland. The density is the second lowest, just emphasising the point that in modern farmland, there are bits and pieces where the birds and things can fit into, but generally it's not that wonderfully good. I don't really want to go into woodland just now as it's more complicated, but interestingly, it wasn't quite as good as Hadfast. That is perhaps because a lot of the woods we've got are shelter belts with things like Sitka or maybe sycamore. But we've basically, hopefully, got you to think that scrub is a very good habitat, perhaps undervalued. 1 or 2 examples, it's not all the same. This is North Berwick Law, where we now seem to have got a kind of more compromise, because at one point SNH wanted to take all the gorse off, which really troubled us, because there are things like yellowhammer, which are some red listed species, to make way for various plants. In fact, there's a lot of plant interest, and there's things like grazing. And because of the badgers, they've had to leave this alone. So I think we've now got a situation where we're preserving some of the gorse, and we're also preserving some of the grassland. This one I did want to speak a little bit about because it is quite controversial. It's a very specialised kind of scrub. This is sea buckthorn down at Gullen, and you've probably seen the clouds of 10,000 or more fieldfare that are sometimes there for parts of the winter. However, it turns out to be a very good habitat for all sorts of other birds, some of them in the winter. And the bottom left, this is why I don't think all the wintering blackcaps are necessarily coming to gardens. And top right, and if you don't get lesser whitethroat at Hadfast, you can try the scrub at Aberlady, long-eared owl. There's quite a variety of things. So anyway, that's a little bit on what we found at Hadfast and the lessons. We're going to just spend a few minutes about how things migrate. Now, the obvious thing, and it happens with things like top left there, we've got the eagles and things that you might see at a place like Gibraltar. When they're going off to Africa, well, they obviously go the route that doesn't involve going across the sea. Bottom right, you've got white storks. And these big birds do this. There's an example of some eagles, and they're coming down from places like Sweden, and they're crossing at Gibraltar, they're crossing at Italy, they're crossing at the Bosphorus, they're going down here. However, lots of small birds don't do that, and this is something that was first realised around about World War II when the first radar sets got going. And this was the kind of thing, the operators described them as radar angels because they didn't know what they were till somebody said, well, you're getting them in spring and autumn, it must be birds. And eventually after the war, David Lack managed to get permission to get students into some of the radar sets that Fighter Command had been using, which were becoming decommissioned. And they did this all around Britain, and they realised that there was a whole lot of bird migration going on that nobody had ever seen. This is, couldn't get any up-to-date British stuff, but there's a picture from Texas, and you can see they're actually picking up. They realise that these markings, these are the birds moving their way up into America in the spring, North America rather. Another picture, a little gift type thing. This is birds moving into Florida from Cuba. So what we're finding with a lot of these little birds, they often do this at night, and they don't just go for little land bridges, they basically go for it, and they're quite happy to cross quite big sea areas. Sometimes they get this top left, I think it was a tropical storm somewhere, and you can see this has got so violent, the migrating birds have got caught up into it. And this is often when you do get unusual birds turning up, say in Britain, it's because they've been caught up in something like this and blown across the Atlantic. The weather map here is not quite so extreme. It's not far off what we've got just now, high pressure. The difference is that there's a front here. And although that's a May picture, in autumn, if you really want to see some of these rare warblers, you get this sort of situation because they've set off in migration, say in Russia in calm conditions, they've come down, but they've got hit an easterly airflow, and some of them have got drifted, and then they hit this front, and if they hit this weather front, they get shoved onto here and they land on St. Abbs or the Isle of May. Okay, we trying to work out why exactly or how they were migrating. This was an early experiment with somebody, Kramer, and basically he showed that with starlings, he had a starling in a little aviary type thing, and basically he found that if you used some mirrors so that the sun appeared to change its position, the starling started moving differently. So people quite early on realized that the birds were to some extent using a compass. And the other thing they did, the bottom right, is meant to be a picture of a planetarium, because as we say, a lot of them move at night. And they found that if you put some of these warblers into a planetarium in their little cages, and if you moved the planetarium roof, the birds were quite clearly moving themselves, and they were to some extent using the stars as a compass. Then this guy Perdick did this interesting experiment with starlings. And what he did was he basically moved some starlings from here, which is in Holland, down to Switzerland, and he let them go again. Now, the dots show you that some of them, the black dots were mainly the young ones, and the black dots basically headed off southwest. They didn't realize that they had been moved, whereas the white dots, which were the older ones, tried to move up a bit and basically get onto their normal, because normally they'd be moving from here down this way, and suddenly we've now got them doing this. So what this showed is that it wasn't totally built into them, that the young birds needed to do a certain amount of learning, which is interesting because they don't go around in little family groups the way that swans and geese do. This was another experiment that the Germans did. The Germans have done some very interesting stuff here. And basically they had this hand-reared garden warbler, which normally would be heading off to Africa. Hopefully the graph shows up. Now the thing was kept in good conditions, plenty of food and all the rest of it, but it wasn't able to see the sun and the stars and all these sorts of things. And what happened was that at certain times of the year, this is a male bird, it must have been, the testis developed. Restlessness, it started to hop around. It obviously was thinking about moving, and it was certain times of the year it was doing this. The body weight, it was being fed the same amount all the time, it could eat as much as it wanted. It suddenly put on weight at certain times, and all of this is evidence that certainly part of this migratory system is built into them, even if it also requires a certain amount of learning with the young birds. This was another experiment they did with garden warblers. And basically they had these things in an aviary, and they measured the way in which they were hopping around the aviary, and they noticed that at certain times of the year, in August and September, they were mainly moving or trying to move southwest. October, December, they were starting to move southeast. April, June, they were starting to move north to northeast. Now, that makes quite a lot of sense if you look at what these things would be doing, because from, say, Germany in the autumn, they head down towards Spain. They then have to reorientate themselves or they'll drown in the Atlantic. They get down to West Africa. This here is the range of garden warblers, but a lot of our ones, or even the German ones, won't go down here. That'll be the Russian ones. And then they come back up the way. Now, probably it would be more accurate if we said they were wintering here and then they headed back this way. So more evidence that these things they've got a kind of clock built into them. This was an interesting thing done in Rybaczy, if that's the right pronunciation. It's on the Baltics. It used to be Rossitten when the Germans had it, and there's a famous bird centre there. And what they did here is they're looking into the extent to which bird migration is affected by the Earth's magnetic field. And what they did was they first started off with these reed warblers, and here we have got the adult reed warbler down, well, let me get this right, yes, and over on the left we've got the young reed warbler. Now, when they were in their natural magnetic field as they would normally have it in the edge of the Baltic, you will see they naturally gravitate in a kind of west-southwest direction, and this is true for both the young ones and the adult. So naturally they were moving in the right direction. However, what they then did is they played around with the magnetic field. The birds didn't go to Scotland, but the magnetic field was changed so that it was the kind of magnetic field you would have in and around Edinburgh. And what they found is that the young birds couldn't cope with this, and they were going in all directions. If you look at this bottom circle, the older birds did. You'll notice they were much more organized, and most of them started to totally change direction to basically compensate for the fact that they realized there was something wrong. Now, apologies for this dreadfully complicated thing. All we're going to do is pick out one or two things from it. This is still not proven, but people are now looking more and more into this idea that birds can pick up the Earth's magnetic field. And because the Earth's magnetic field, if you look at the right-hand thing here, it basically changes from the equator to round about where we are, much further north as you get towards the pole, and they seem to be able to pick this up. And the way they seem to be able to do it, and this is all that's happening, is that the molecules within probably the eye or maybe the brain move around. Ignore all the maths and all this kind of stuff. All it's really saying is that they seem to be able to pick up the Earth's magnetic field, and that the movement within the molecules allows them to do this. It's still pretty experimental. And this is a summary. This is an American warbler, which is, they're different to our ones, they're more colourful. And all it's really trying to summarise for you is that birds imprint on, learn the patterns of the sun and the stars, but there's also chemistry and electronic stuff going on in the eyes and the brain, which also helps them to navigate. There may be something in the rear, which is what they're saying there. And bottom left, something we don't associate much with birds, that they can actually smell their way around. So there's quite a complicated situation. And if that's all been too much for you, then I've suggested here's a little summary graph. Okay, one bit of quite very recent research, very high quality stuff. This is this business about the geolocators. Now, obviously, the question is, are these harming the birds? Well, given that the birds are migrating and coming back and all this, the answer seems to be no, which is what you want, because there's no point in putting something on a bird if you end up getting the bird to do something that is not normal. And this isn't the kind of thing you could have seen in the wildlife films with, say, elephants and rhinos, where there's a great big collar goes on and it sends out signals. This thing is tiny, and basically it works. It's linked to light, and if you go on the BTO website, they'll tell you all about it and the maths behind it, and it's quite complicated maths. You have to get the bird back, and you have to get the little geolocator, and it's to do with the different light levels at different latitudes, basically, and that allows you to work out where the bird has been. Now, what did they find from this? Well, if we look at this, one interesting thing is about blackcaps is that there's a thing called a migratory divide. Blackcaps within maybe 100 miles of one another, these ones all head down this way, these ones head down this way. Now, why should that be? Well, remember that not that long ago, the Sahara wasn't a desert. Up here was snow and ice. As things changed, birds from here would work their way up. This area probably became bird friendly quicker than maybe Central Europe or the Alps. Similarly, up here, this started to melt out. So you had these different populations, and this really reflects the history of the post-ice age and things. And so it made sense for them to keep doing this. What they've then found out, partly because of these just little locators, and partly when somebody actually did an experiment where they actually, in an aviary, crossbred, one's from the east and one's from the west, is that some of them are now doing this. They're going down the middle, which probably seems a fairly sensible thing to do. So we've got evolution in action here. The other thing, though, in the bottom right, this is the further details about the ones that come to Britain. And they used to think they were just coming from maybe East Europe. And what they're finding now is that these are birds from a big wide range of Europe heading north to Britain for the winter. And obviously that's further evolution in action, because some years ago, if a young bird set off and came to Britain in winter, it would probably die. But nowadays they're getting through it. So blackcaps are doing quite well, partly because the furthest ones away are going to North Africa, and they can come back to us quite quickly. But there are now some that are actually wintering in Britain, and they can get to their breeding grounds maybe here, which is even quicker. So blackcaps are doing very, very well because they're adjusting their migration strategy to fit in with changing climate. It's not just warblers, blackbirds and robins. I know you may have some in your garden all year. Thousands of these things come into Scotland every autumn. Goldcrest you may not have in your garden, but this thing, 4 grams. Thousands of these come across the North Sea. I think the biggest count in the Isle of May they ever had a goldcrest was 15,000. So there's an awful lot of migration going on. We all know that redwing and fieldfare are migrants. The fieldfare is relatively straightforward. The bottom there, they come from Scandinavia, and I once had a look at the ringing. We get more from Norway than we do from Sweden, and more from Sweden than from Finland. So they're just crossing the North Sea. The redwing is much more complex. The ordinary redwing, which is the left there, showing the red, which is actually below the wing, this is the one that's coming from Scandinavia. And the pattern there is quite different. There are more from Finland than there are from Sweden, Norway put together. There are probably even more from Russia, but there isn't much more going on in Russia. So they really do wander a bit. The Icelandic ones, and there's an Icelandic one there, they're bigger and darker, are coming in this way. So there's quite a complicated thing there. This thing is in just to show you the amazing flight distances. This is the Greenland wheat here. We sometimes get these going through, but some of them are actually going from South Greenland, parts of Canada, right down to West Africa in one go. And you think, why on earth did they not just go to the United States? But again, this is something that probably reflects when climate and all the rest of it was all very, very different. Cuckoos, there's lots of interesting stuff being done on cuckoos. The ones we get parasitized medipipits, so there's a cuckoo's egg in a pipit nest. There's the thing being fed. This is what they come here for. Like the swallows, there's lots of cuckoos in Africa, and our ones come to get away from them, and they winter in these moist forests. And now the BTO have got, these are some of the British cuckoos, and what they're finding out is that some go this way and some go that way. And then people have done the same thing in Europe. And what we're finding is that basically the further east you go, the further east they tend to be in Africa. But a lot of them are getting into these moist forests and moving around. And again, look at this. These are some enthusiasts in China, and some of them have got British type names, and some of them have got Chinese type names. And the Chinese ones are also heading down for East Africa, which seems a long way to go. But again, these are things that have developed over quite a long period. And this is something else because of this technology. These are swifts tagged in Foulmere in southeast England. And the interesting thing here is this thing's gone down to West Africa, which what you'd expect. It's then moved around within Africa. And remember, these things, when they're not breeding, they fly all the time. So you've got this, it's basically moving around here, following the big thunderstorms and the termite swarms. There's lots of birds move within Africa, which never get to us. These are carmine bee-eaters, just to brighten things up. Something a little bit about some of the shorebirds we get. Turnstone and purple sandpiper you often get together along the Lothian coast. Turnstone, which is this one here, it seems very brightly coloured, but if you look at it sitting on the tundra, you can see why. It's actually disruptive, and it's not badly camouflaged at all. Mostly our ones are coming from Greenland or Canada. Purple sandpiper is more complicated. They may mix with the turnstones in winter, but the ones we get along the east coast, they're only coming from parts of high plateau in Norway. But we're now realizing that some of the ones in places like Orkney, they measure slightly differently, and they're coming, as far as we can gather, maybe from as far north as Svalbard. And that's what a purple sandpiper, the bottom picture there, looks like in the summer. Not another one. Our ones come from Greenland, which is a fair journey, but if you look at the green picture there, they're coming down to the North Sea. If you look at this bottom graph, this was done by the warden at Aberlady, and you'll see this big spike. So they don't come straight to us, they tend to come down, they probably go over to the Bodensee and they molt there, and then they make their way around the North Sea. If you look at some of the other knot populations, our ones are actually relatively short distance. Some of them go, these wading birds go big differences. This is quite an interesting, done by the Highland Ringing Group, and we'll have to speed up a little bit. They managed to put this little radio type thing on this curlew, and you think curlews, they must breed in our local hills. Well, no, what they found is this thing went off to breed in Finland, and there's some evidence there that many of the curlew we get in the East Coast, more evidence of it. And this is why, although curlew are actually in some trouble in Britain and Ireland, if we look along here, the soft grey line, they're not in trouble in Finland. So just because you're seeing a lot of curlews along the beach in the winter doesn't mean they're okay. Similarly with ringed plover, they're now in terrible trouble along the East Lothian coast, but there are birds coming through from the Arctic, which, if you like, mask the situation. Just one or two other ones. This was this extraordinary thing as a result of RSPB work in Fettler. They wanted to know where the small population of Fettler red-necked phalaropes went. They thought they would go down like the Scandinavian ones and head to, in some cases, towards the Arabian Gulf. In fact, the thing, it went right across the Atlantic, and it didn't just stop there, it then went down the Pacific, which nobody had expected. And this is this record breaker. We get bar-tail godbits, but not these ones. These things are going from Alaska in one flight down to New Zealand, and they're taking maybe 9 or 10 days flying. They are putting so much stress on their bodies that they're not just burning the fat they've laid down, they're actually burning muscle, so they seem to be able to bounce back from that. Terns you probably know about. In terms of a long journey, they're the longest of the lot, but then of course they can feed along the way, which some of the other things we've been talking about didn't. Height, bar-headed geese. I don't know if they go across Everest, but they certainly get a fair height in the Himalaya. When you try breathing at 20,000 feet. Waxwing, which everybody likes to see in the winter, these are not regular migrants, they're simply eruptions when there's a poor berry crop in Scandinavia. They come in and go for our cotoneasters and things. And since we've talked about all sorts of things moving, one thing that is often thought to move in big numbers but probably doesn't is wood pigeon. You get huge flocks of wood pigeon in autumn and winter, and a lot of country folk tell you they're probably coming from Norway, but all the evidence is that people don't realise how many wood pigeons we've got. Anyway, just a few things to finish. It isn't just birds. We used to think that the monarch butterflies in America were remarkable because of migration. We now know that painted ladies are even longer migrants. Our ones seem to start in Morocco. They breed, and the ones that maybe hatched out in Spain and places like this come up to us. Mammals migrate, although in some cases they can no longer do so because of human activity. You've got the very well-known ones in places like Africa. You've got other ones up in, these are the caribou in the Arctic. Whales, they don't have the same problems about, well, they do have some problems with humans, but at least there aren't blockages across the sea. I think this is fairly well known now. That picture's not mine, it was taken by a chap over off Kirkcaldy. Humpback whales. Various lobsters, all sorts of things move. I was tempted by this because the title Human Migration, I think this is from National Geographic, all it's really showing is that humans spread around the world. Humans, at least us, our modern humans, unlike so many birds and things, don't migrate, or do they? This is an old picture now because this sort of thing doesn't happen in Scotland, but people did used to move up and down hills with the summer grazing and then moving the cattle down. So humans, at least until recently, probably moved around quite a bit as well. And this is a more modern picture, as you can see by the girl's dress. This is the transhumancia in places like Spain. So, I meant to update this, but I've been using this. What an odd thing to finish with. The reason I'm doing this is what I hope I've shared with you a little bit tonight is there's all sorts of interesting things being found out about birds, mostly not by me, but this is against the background of people like this character and this, well, there's a little bit of fun here, but the reality is that if you're wanting effective conservation, you've got to base it on knowledge. And yet this character, we're getting similar people in this country. There's almost an anti-knowledge thing, and basically we're not going to be interested in facts and hard information. We're just going to go in emotion and stirring things up, which is a slightly sad thing to finish on, but I think it may be realistic. And all I'm really saying is, all you people are interested in conservation. To have effective conservation, it's not just enough to fight back emotionally. You've got to fight back on the basis with good information. And that hopefully is the kind of thing we've been talking about tonight. And it's time I shut up and stop sharing. And that's me finished.
Thank you very much, Stan, for this fascinating overview of migrations about a number of birds. Do we have any questions we want to ask Stan? We've had one from Cathal. I might start with that while other people come in. She pointed out that when you were going through the different warblers and particularly mentioning the wood warbler, and she wondered, is the wood warbler declining across all of its range, or is it just having an impact on Scotland?
Very good question. And one of the reasons why people are so concerned, yes, they seem to be declining in many parts of Europe. So that's why there's so much interest in it. And as I was alluding to, I think the evidence is more and more swinging. There are problems in woodlands in Britain, many of them due to excess numbers of deer, but that doesn't seem to explain it. The work is still going on, but they're more and more looking towards what's happening probably in Africa.
Yeah, I certainly picked up on the. Do you think it's a simple pattern, and most probably I got it wrong, but this big dichotomy between short distant migrants and long distant migrants? Do you think there's a clear two such camps as to how well they're bearing, or?
I think that's reasonable. I think there are other things, all of these things are complex, but it is quite striking that quite a number of the long distance migrants, I don't know if it's showing with swallows, then swallows are very good at flying, whereas some of these other things don't normally fly other than, in quite short distances, still the migration. And there seems to be some differences. This is why it's interesting to find out just what they do in Africa, because Africa is a big place. We've already talked about the whitethroats being along the edge of the desert, and they suffered, although they've picked up again, whereas some of the ones that are in the moist forests that didn't seem to be in so much trouble now do. But for example, willow warblers go into these moist African forests. They seem to be okay in Scotland. As far as I know, they're okay in places like Norway. The reason they're not doing so well in England may simply be that they're a bird that quite likes it fairly cool. It may also be that if you look at southeast England, there's a lot of evidence of decline in insect numbers, decline in moths and things like this. So you've really got to do as much work as you can in feeding all the different things. If there aren't enough insects around, if there are less moths, less caterpillars, there's going to be less food for things like willow warblers. But what you then do is you say, okay, if willow warblers are declining in places like Surrey, are other small birds that eat insects declining in Surrey as well? And that'll give you a pointer as to whether it's something specific to willow warblers or there's a general habitat impoverishment in southeast England, which there probably is.
Yes, yeah. Okay, are there any further questions? Have you picked up any questions, Carmina, that I might have missed, or?
Well, there's something in the chat we should maybe look at.
Yeah.
Except I'm not.
A lot of thanks very much. Great talks.
Very kind, thank you.
Yeah, no question, no further question. And with regards to your former point, I've read in, I think it might have been the Woodland Trust, they were saying that because of climate change, caterpillars were coming erupting earlier, and that may have an effect on the breeding success of blue tits. Do you think that this adds up for now, or is that?
It's
Or
certainly possible. I mean,
Mhm.
I think there's been much speculation on this. I don't know how much hard evidence there is. When I think things do adapt. Now, okay, they adapt in the sense that the ones that don't adapt die. And going right back to the earlier, there's a lot more dying goes on in the natural world than maybe we realise. But I would be reasonably optimistic about that. I think the main thing is the habitat, and that's why, you know, whether it's an old gravel pit or an old railway, if you've got the habitat, then things will, I'm sure, be able to use it. But if you totally blitz the habitat by very intensive farming or by covering everything open in concrete, then they're not going to adapt. I think that's the basic point.
Yeah.
I think it's very relevant. I mean, one of the things I don't know how good it is, but to go away from birds, wasn't there an old shalebing in West Lothian that turned out to be a superb place for orchids? You know, and in many parts of northern Britain, some of your best wildlife sites are former areas of industry. Union Canal's another one. You know, the wildlife doesn't look at it. It doesn't say, oh dear, there's an old coal tip. That's not a very nice place. It actually says there's some scrub on this and I'll go and, you know, breed in it. And by contrast, some of the most scenic parts of the West Highlands, ecologically, they're quite impoverished, even although the scenery looks great.
Yeah. There's a quick question on, I saw 2 male blackcaps this winter in my garden. Do they stick together over winter?
I'm not aware of any evidence. The 2 males certainly wouldn't normally stick together because in the breeding season they'd be fighting one another. So I think it's probably just that you've generously provided lots of food, and certainly blackcaps will come. They will take berries and things in winter. They'll come to fat. They're not necessarily insectivorous in the winter.
Okay. But thanks very much. Unless there are any other questions or some questions we'd like to ask, you can either unmute yourself or just type your question in the chat box. No? But, okay, so I'll call. Thanks. I'll thank again, Stan, for your thoughts. Really enjoyed the overview you gave of the different warblers that appear in the Lowlands, and listening to all their calls. It was really nice and instructive, and also quite relaxing. So thanks for that, and also all the insights you gave us on migration and how troubling and complicated, but yet fascinating all of that seems to be. So thanks very much for this talk and for joining us tonight, and thank you all for joining us and listening to Stan, and have a nice evening. Okay, bye everyone.